May I repair your fence for a piece of bread? The words hung in the crisp autumn air like smoke from a dying campfire. Lucia Herrera stood at the edge of Wamakaskin's property, her weathered hands gripping a bundle of rusted tools, her dark eyes reflecting the desperation of 3 days without food. But when the Arikara hunter emerged from his cabin and saw her standing there, he froze completely, his breath catching in his throat as if he'd seen a ghost walking across the prairie wind. The Dakota Territory stretched endlessly in all directions, a sea of golden grass broken only by the occasional cottonwood grove and the snaking line of the Missouri River in the distance. September had brought the first hints of winter's approach, with mornings sharp enough to cut glass and afternoons that still carried summer's dying warmth.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
This was hard country, unforgiving land that demanded everything from those who dared. To call it home, Wamakaskin had lived on this particular stretch of prairie for 7 years now, ever since the treaty negotiations had shifted tribal boundaries and left him caught between two worlds. His cabin sat like a weathered sentinel against the horizon, built with his own hands from cottonwood logs and chinked with prairie clay. Behind it stretched his horse corral, enclosed by a fence that had seen better days, its posts leaning at odd angles and several rails hanging loose or missing entirely. He was a man of 32 winters, tall and lean with the kind of quiet strength that came from years of tracking elk across endless plains and reading weather signs in the flight patterns of migrating birds. His hair hung in 2 braids decorated with eagle feathers earned through deeds of courage, and his clothes mixed traditional Arikara buckskin with practical frontier wool and cotton. Most settlers gave him a wide berth, uncertain whether to fear him or respect him, but those who knew him understood that Wamakaskin was a man of his word, someone who honored both the old ways and the new realities of a changing world. On this particular morning, he had been preparing to ride out on a hunting expedition that would take him north toward the Yellowstone River, where buffalo herds still grazed in numbers large enough to sustain a man through the coming winter. His horse, a paint stallion named Thunderwalker, stamped impatiently in the corral while Wamakaskin checked his rifle and packed dried corn and pemmican into his saddlebags. The broken fence could wait until spring, he had decided, or at least until after he returned with enough meat to see him through the cold months ahead. That was when he heard the voice calling across the morning stillness, speaking words in accented English that made him turn toward the sound with curious attention. What he saw made his blood run cold and his heart hammer against his ribs like a trapped bird trying to escape its cage. Lucia Herrera stood perhaps 50 yards away, silhouetted against the rising sun that painted the prairie grass in shades of copper and gold. She was small and compact, built like someone who had known hard work all her life, with calloused hands and shoulders that spoke of years spent wielding tools heavier than most women ever touched. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical braid, and her clothes, though clean and carefully mended, showed the wear of too many miles and too little money. She carried herself with dignity despite her obvious circumstances, standing straight-backed even as exhaustion and hunger threatened to buckle her knees. But it was not her appearance that stopped Wamakaskin cold. It was the leather tool belt wrapped around her waist, a belt he recognized with crystal clarity despite the years that had passed since he last saw it. The leather was darker now, worn smooth by countless hours of use, but the distinctive pattern of carved thunderbirds along its edge was unmistakable. Those thunderbirds had been cut by a man's careful knife during long winter evenings by firelight, each detail etched with the patience of someone who understood that good work took time. Miguel Herrera had worn that belt every day for the 3 years he and Wamakaskin had worked together, building fences in barns and corrals for settlers who needed strong backs and skilled hands more than they needed to understand where those hands came from. Miguel had been a master carpenter, a man who could look at a pile of rough lumber and see the finished structure it would become. Who could join wood with such precision that his joints looked like they had grown that way naturally? He had also been one of the few white men Wamakaskin had ever called friend, someone who treated him as an equal rather than a curiosity or a threat. Now Miguel's widow stood before him, asking for work in exchange for bread, wearing the belt that had once held the tools of the finest craftsman Wamakaskin had ever known. The sight hit him like a physical blow, bringing back memories he had carefully buried beneath years of solitary living and deliberate forgetting. Lucia waited patiently for his response, unaware of the storm of recognition and grief playing across his features. She had learned patience the hard way, through months of walking from town to town seeking work, being turned away from most places because she was a woman, a Mexican, or simply because there was no work to be had. The tool belt around her waist represented everything she had left of her previous life, the life she had shared with a man who could build anything and fix everything, who had died too young and left her to navigate a world that had little patience for widows without family or fortune. She had been walking for 3 days since leaving the settlement at Fort Berthold, surviving on wild berries and water from prairie streams, sleeping under stars that offered no warmth against the growing cold of approaching autumn. Her last piece of bread had been eaten yesterday morning, and her stomach cramped with hunger that made her lightheaded and unsteady on her feet. But she had spotted the broken fence from miles away, seen it as a potential opportunity rather than just another sign of frontier hardship. Wamakaskin finally found his voice, though it came out rougher than he intended, weighted with emotions. He was not prepared to examine. "Where did you get that belt?" he asked, his English careful and precise despite the turmoil in his chest. Lucia's hand instinctively went to the leather around her waist, her fingers tracing the carved thunderbirds with unconscious affection. "It belonged to my husband," she replied, her voice carrying the quiet dignity of someone who had learned to speak of loss without breaking. "Miguel Herrera, he was a carpenter, a good one. He made this belt himself during our first winter together. Said the thunderbirds would bring good fortune to his work." The name hit Wamakaskin like a punch to the solar plexus, confirming what he had already known in his heart, but hoped against logic might somehow be wrong. Miguel Herrera, the laughing Mexican who had taught him to read English blueprints and shown him how to use a spirit level, who had shared his lunch every day and never once made Wamakaskin feel like he was receiving charity rather than friendship. Miguel, who had talked endlessly about his wife back in Santa Fe, describing her skill with needle and thread, her way with garden vegetables, her determination to join him once he had saved enough money to send for her passage north. "Miguel spoke of you," Wamakaskin said quietly, his dark eyes studying her face with new intensity. "He called you his Estrelita, his little star. Said you could sow a straight seam in the dark and grow corn in pure sand." Lucia's breath caught in her throat, her eyes widening with surprise and something that might have been hope. "You knew Miguel, but how, when?" "He never mentioned working with anyone named—" She paused, realizing she did not even know this man's name despite asking him for work. "Wamakaskin," he supplied, then added the English translation he had learned to provide for those who struggled with Dakota words. "It means strong bear. I worked with your husband for 3 seasons, building for the homesteaders who came after the treaty. He was a good man, a skilled craftsman. He saved my life once when a barn roof collapsed. The morning wind picked up, sending golden leaves, skittering across the ground between them and carrying the scent of distant wood smoke from some unseen chimney." Lucia stood very still, processing this unexpected connection to her past, this thread that tied her current desperation to happier times when Miguel had been alive, and their future had seemed full of possibility rather than uncertainty. "He died 2 years ago," she said finally, her voice steady despite the pain that still lived in her chest like a permanent bruise. "Pneumonia took him during a hard winter in Colorado Territory.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
I tried to keep his business going, but most people would not hire a woman to do a man's work, no matter how well she could handle his tools. Wamakuskin nodded slowly, understanding, flowing between them without need for detailed explanation. The frontier was hard on everyone, but it was particularly cruel to those who did not fit into neat categories, those who found themselves caught between worlds or expectations. He himself lived that reality every day, too Indian for most white settlers, too westernized for some of his own people. "The fence," Lucia said, gesturing toward the broken rails behind him, trying to bring the conversation back to practical matters, even as her heart raced with the unexpected gift of meeting someone who had known and respected Miguel. "I can repair it properly, make it stronger than it was before. Miguel taught me everything he knew about working with wood, about reading the grain and understanding how different pieces want to fit together." Wamakuskin looked back at his corral fence, seeing it with new eyes now that he knew who was offering to fix it. The work would indeed need doing before winter, and he had been dreading the prospect of tackling it alone with his hunting expedition looming. His shoulder still ached from an old injury sustained during a buffalo hunt, making the kind of heavy lifting required for fence repair more challenging than it once had been. But more than the practical considerations, something in Lucia's bearing reminded him powerfully of Miguel. The same quiet confidence in her abilities, the same way of looking at broken things and seeing them whole. If she truly possessed even half of her husband's skill, the fence would be better than new when she finished with it. "You are hungry," he observed, noting the slight tremor in her hands, the way she swayed almost imperceptibly on her feet. It was a statement rather than a question, spoken with the matter-of-fact directness of someone who had known hunger himself and recognized its signs in others. Lucia lifted her chin slightly, pride warring with necessity in her expression. "I can work hungry," she said firmly. "I have done it before. Payment can wait until the job is finished." Wamakuskin studied her for a long moment, remembering Miguel's stories about his wife's stubborn independence, her refusal to accept help she had not earned. The memory brought a ghost of a smile to his weathered features. "Miguel told me you were prouder than a Mustang stallion and twice as stubborn," he said, then gestured toward his cabin. "Come, we will eat first, then discuss the fence. No one does good work on an empty stomach, and Miguel would haunt my dreams if I let his Estrelita collapse from hunger on my property." Lucia hesitated, clearly torn between her immediate needs and her determination to maintain dignity in desperate circumstances. But the mention of Miguel's pet name for her, spoken with obvious affection and respect, seemed to tip the balance. She nodded once, a sharp, decisive movement. "Thank you," she said simply, then added with formal courtesy, "I am Lucia Herrera, and I am honored to meet a friend of my husband." Wamakuskin led her toward his cabin, noting how she walked with quick, efficient steps despite her obvious exhaustion, how her eyes automatically cataloged the construction details of his buildings and the condition of his equipment. She moved like someone who understood the rhythm of physical work, who could assess a job's requirements at a glance. The cabin's interior was sparse but clean, furnished with handmade furniture that showed both skill and care in its construction. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth swept clean and ready for the evening's fire. Shelves held carefully organized supplies, and hunting trophies shared wall space with a few books and a daguerreotype of an elderly Arikara woman who had been Wamakuskin's grandmother. Lucia's attention was immediately drawn to a wooden chest sitting near the window, its surface decorated with intricate carving that made her breath catch with recognition. The style was unmistakably Miguel's work, from the flowing lines of the decorative border to the precise joinery of the corners. "He made that for me," Wamakuskin said, following her gaze. "Payment for helping him with a difficult barn raising." Said every man needed at least one piece of furniture that would outlast him. Lucia approached the chest slowly, her fingers hovering over the carved surface without quite touching it. Seeing Miguel's handiwork here, in this unexpected place, felt like receiving a message from beyond the grave, a reminder that her husband's skill and kindness had touched more lives than she knew. Wamakaskin moved to his cook stove, stirring coals to life and setting a pot of water to boil. From his supplies, he gathered cornmeal and dried meat, the makings of a simple but nourishing meal that would restore strength without overwhelming a stomach too long empty. "Tell me about the work you have done since Miguel's death," he said. As he prepared food, his voice carefully neutral. "Where have you traveled? What have you built?" Lucia settled onto a rough wooden stool, grateful to rest her aching feet while she watched him work. His movements in the kitchen were efficient and practiced, those of a man long accustomed to caring for himself without fuss or complaint. "I have built chicken coops and repaired wagon wheels," she began, her voice growing stronger as she talked about the work that defined her. "I helped raise a barn in Nebraska Territory and fixed the roof on a schoolhouse in Kansas. Mostly small jobs, quick repairs that people would trust to a woman if the price was right and no man was available." She paused, remembering the frustration of being turned away from larger projects, of watching inferior work being accepted simply because it came from male hands. "I am better with wood than most men I have met, but few will give me the chance to prove it." Wamakaskin nodded understanding as he stirred cornmeal into the boiling water, creating a thick porridge that would fill her stomach and provide lasting energy. He had faced similar skepticism from settlers who could not see past his skin color to evaluate his actual abilities. "Miguel always said that good work speaks for itself," he offered, ladling the hot porridge into wooden bowls and adding strips of dried venison. "But sometimes people need to hear it speaking before they will listen." The simple meal tasted like a feast to Lucia's starved system, and she ate slowly to avoid making herself sick after days of near fasting. Between bites, she studied Wamakaskin's face, seeing intelligence and kindness there, along with the wariness that seemed to be a permanent feature of frontier life. "Why did you and Miguel stop working together?" she asked finally, curiosity overcoming caution. "He never mentioned any partner in his letters, and he wrote to me regularly while he was traveling." Wamakaskin's expression darkened slightly, shadows of old pain crossing his features like clouds moving across the sun. He set down his spoon and stared into his bowl for several long moments before answering. "There was trouble in Deadwood," he said finally, his voice carefully controlled. "Some men decided that Indians should not be taking work from white settlers, even when that work was fairly won and skillfully done. They made threats, caused problems for anyone who hired us. Miguel wanted to fight it, said we should not let ignorance drive us away from honest work." He paused, the memory clearly still painful after all these years. "But I knew how these things ended. I had seen other partnerships destroyed by fear and hatred. So I left, came here to live alone where my presence would not endanger anyone else." Lucia absorbed this information quietly, understanding the sacrifice he had made and the loneliness it must have cost him. Miguel had indeed been the type to fight injustice wherever he found it, sometimes with more courage than wisdom. "He never forgot you," she said softly. "In his last letters, he mentioned hoping to find his old partner someday, to introduce me to the man who had taught him so much about reading the land and working with local materials." The words hung in the air between them, carrying weight. But neither had expected when this day began. Outside, the wind continued to whisper through the prairie grass, and somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried out as it circled high above the endless expanse of Dakota Territory. Wamakaskin stood abruptly, walking to the window to stare out at his broken fence. The practical matter of repairs suddenly seemed less important than the larger questions raised by Lucia's unexpected appearance. After years of careful solitude, he found himself confronted with a living reminder of friendship lost and opportunities Abandoned. The fence will require 2 days of work if done properly, he said without turning around. New posts for the weakest sections, fresh rails cut to proper length, all joints fitted tight enough to last through winter storms. Lucia joined him at the window, her professional eye automatically assessing the scope of the project. "I have the tools and the knowledge," she confirmed. Miguel's tools, well maintained and sharp. They remember good work even when hands change. Wamakaskin finally turned to face her, his decision made. "Then we will repair the fence together," he said firmly. "Partners, as Miguel and I once were. You will work, I will pay fairly, and we will honor his memory through honest craftsmanship." The morning sun climbed higher over the Dakota territory. As Lucia and Wamakaskin stood together at his kitchen window, both studying the broken fence that stretched behind his cabin like a jagged scar across the golden prairie. The shared meal had restored some color to Lucia's cheeks, and the warmth of recognition between them had begun to thaw the careful distance that frontier life demanded between strangers. But beneath the surface of their newfound connection, deeper currents stirred, carrying memories and obligations that neither had expected to confront on this crisp September day. Wamakaskin moved first, walking to a corner of the cabin where his own tools hung in careful arrangement on wooden pegs. His collection was smaller than what Lucia carried in Miguel's leather belt, but each piece showed the wear patterns of regular use and proper maintenance. He selected a measuring tape and a carpenter's square, then paused with his hand on a distinctive wooden mallet whose handle bore carved symbols that were clearly Arikara in origin. "Miguel made this for me," he said, lifting the mallet and turning it so Lucia could see the intricate designs. He said every craftsman needed tools that carried the spirit of his people. That good work came from honoring both skill and heritage. Lucia stepped closer to examine the mallet, her fingers tracing the carved symbols with reverent attention. The workmanship was unmistakably her husband's, from the perfect balance of the head to the smooth finish that would prevent blisters during long hours of use. But the decorative elements were something new, a fusion of Miguel's Mexican craftsmanship with designs that spoke of ancient traditions and spiritual beliefs she did not fully understand. "He never mentioned making tools for others," she said, softly, wonder coloring her voice. "But then, there was much about his work travels that he kept to himself, probably to spare me worry about the dangers he faced." Wamakaskin hefted the mallet experimentally, feeling its familiar weight in his palm. "Your husband understood that tools are more than wood and metal," he explained, his voice taking on the cadence of someone sharing sacred knowledge. "He said they carry the intentions of their maker and the dreams of those who use them. This mallet has helped build homes for 3 families and corrals for more horses than I can count." They gathered the remaining tools they would need and walked together toward the broken fence, their boots crushing dried prairie grass that released the dusty sweet scent of approaching autumn. The corral enclosed nearly an acre of ground, large enough to hold a dozen horses comfortably, though currently it housed only Thunder Walker and a gentle Mare named Wind Dancer that Wamakaskin used for longer journeys when speed mattered less than endurance. The fence damage was more extensive than it had appeared from a distance. Several posts had rotted at ground level, victims of too many wet springs and harsh winters without proper maintenance. Rails hung at precarious angles, their mortise joints weakened by years of expanding and contracting wood. The gate itself leaned drunkenly on broken hinges, held closed only by a loop of rawhide that served as a temporary latch. Lucia walked the entire perimeter slowly, her experienced eye cataloging each problem and mentally calculating the materials and time required for proper repairs. Wamakaskin followed a few steps behind, watching her work and remembering how Miguel had moved in exactly the same way, with the focused attention of someone who saw structural problems as puzzles to be solved rather than obstacles to be endured. "The foundation posts here and here need to be completely replaced," she said, pointing to the worst sections. These 3 can be salvaged if we dig them out, treat the bottoms with pine tar, and reset them properly. The rails will need to be cut down and rejoined where the wood has split, but most of the timber is still sound. Her assessment was thorough and practical, delivered with the confidence of someone who had diagnosed similar problems countless times before. Wamakaskin found himself nodding along with her observations, impressed despite himself by the accuracy of her analysis. "You have your husband's eye for reading wood," he acknowledged. Miguel could look at a damaged structure and see not just what was wrong, but what had caused the problem and how to prevent it from happening again. They began with the most damaged sections, using Wamakaskin's spade to dig out posts that had rotted below ground level. The work was hard and dirty, requiring them to take turns with the heavy tool as they carved through packed earth, made stubborn by recent rains. Lucia worked with steady determination, her smaller frame compensating for lack of size with efficient technique and relentless persistence. As they labored, conversation flowed naturally between them, the rhythm of shared work creating an intimacy that formal introductions could never have achieved. Wamakaskin found himself talking about his life on the prairie, describing the seasonal migrations of the buffalo herds and the subtle signs that predicted harsh winters or abundant summers. Lucia responded with stories of her travels across the territories, painting vivid pictures of the boomtowns and farming settlements that were transforming the landscape of the American West. "Miguel dreamed of buying land someday," she said during a rest break, leaning against a sound fence, post while sweat cooled on her forehead. He wanted to build a real house, not just the temporary shelters that most settlers accepted. Something that would last for generations, with proper foundations and tight joints that would never sag or settle. Wamakaskin passed her his water gourd, noting how she drank sparingly despite her obvious thirst. "Did he ever find the right place?" he asked. "Land that spoke to him the way this valley spoke to me when I first saw it?" Lucia shook her head, sadness flickering across her features like a cloud shadow racing across open ground. "We were still saving money, still planning and dreaming. Miguel said the right land would wait for us, that good things came to those who prepared themselves properly. But then the sickness took him, and all our plans became just memories." The afternoon progressed with steady work, their combined efforts gradually bringing order to the chaos of broken rails and tilted posts. Wamakaskin found himself marveling at Lucia's skill with traditional carpentry techniques, watching as she cut precise mortise joints with hand tools and fitted them together with the kind of craftsmanship that belonged to an earlier era. Before factory-made materials and hurried construction became the frontier norm. "Where did you learn to work wood like this?" he asked as she demonstrated a complex scarf joint that would invisibly repair a cracked rail. Most settlers, even the men, use crude methods that barely hold together through one winter. Lucia smiled with genuine warmth, the first time her expression had been completely free of worry since her arrival. "My father was a furniture maker in Santa Fe," she explained, her hands continuing to work while she spoke. "He believed that everyone in the family should understand honest craftsmanship. That skill with tools was a form of insurance against hardship. When I married Miguel, I already knew how to read wood grain and cut clean joints." She paused in her work to wipe sawdust from her eyes, leaving a streak of dirt across her cheek that somehow made her appear younger and more approachable. "Miguel said I had better hands for detail work than he did, that I could feel what the wood wanted to become. He taught me the heavy construction techniques, but the fine work came naturally." Wamakaskin stored this information carefully, adding it to his growing understanding of the remarkable woman who had appeared at his gate asking for work. The combination of inherited skill and learned technique explained the confidence with which she approached each task, the way she seemed to know instinctively how different pieces would fit together. As the sun reached its zenith, they paused for a more substantial meal, sharing dried meat and corn cakes while sitting in the shade of Wamakaskin's cabin. The work had given them both healthy appetites, and they ate with the satisfaction of people who had earned their food through honest labor. "Tell me about Thunder Walker," Lucia said, nodding toward the paint stallion who watched their activities with intelligent curiosity. "He has the look of a horse with stories to tell." Wamakaskin's expression softened as he looked at his horse, affection clearly visible in his dark eyes. "I raised him from a colt after his mother was killed by wolves," he said. "Fed him by hand, taught him to trust human touch, trained him to respond to voice commands and knee pressure rather than harsh bits and spurs." The horse in question seemed to sense their attention and approached the fence, extending his neck over the top rail to investigate their meal with hopeful interest. Wamakaskin broke off a piece of corn cake and offered it on his open palm, which Thunder Walker accepted with delicate lips and a gentle nicker of appreciation. "Miguel always said you could judge a man's character by how his animals treated him," Lucia observed, watching the obvious bond between horse and rider. "Creatures that have a choice about staying or leaving will only remain with someone worthy of their loyalty." The observation struck Wamakaskin more deeply than Lucia probably intended, touching on questions of belonging and acceptance that had haunted him since his decision to live apart from both white settlements and his own tribal communities. Thunder Walker had indeed chosen to stay, even during periods when the corral gate stood open for days at a time. But the stallion's loyalty could not fill the void left by human companionship. They returned to work refreshed, tackling the more complex repairs that required careful measurement and precise cutting. Lucia demonstrated techniques that Wamakaskin had seen Miguel use, but never fully understood, showing him how to read the stress patterns in damaged wood and work with natural grain lines rather than against them. "Your husband was a patient teacher," Wamakaskin said as he attempted to replicate a joint that Lucia had cut with apparent ease. "But I think you explain things more clearly than he did." Miguel sometimes forgot that not everyone sees wood the way he did. Lucia laughed, a sound that carried genuine joy despite the melancholy circumstances that had brought her to this place. "He used to become so absorbed in his work that he would forget to eat or sleep," she said fondly. "I learned to bring him food and water throughout the day, because left to himself, he would work from sunrise to sunset without stopping." As the afternoon wore on, their conversation deepened, moving beyond the safe territory of shared memories into more personal revelations. Wamakaskin found himself describing the loneliness of his self-imposed exile, the way silence could become oppressive after days without human contact. Lucia responded by talking about the fear that accompanied her constant traveling, the uncertainty of never knowing where her next meal or safe shelter would come from. "Sometimes I dream about having a permanent home again," she admitted as they worked together to lift a heavy replacement post into position. "Not necessarily the grand house that Miguel envisioned, but just a place where I could unpack my tools and leave them set up, where I could plant a garden and know I would be there to harvest it." Wamakaskin braced the post while she packed dirt around its base, their coordinated movements speaking to the easy partnership that had developed between them over the course of the day. "What stops you from settling somewhere?" he asked. "Surely there are communities that would welcome a skilled craftswoman, especially in the territories where good help is scarce." Lucia paused in her tamping, considering how to explain the complex web of practical and emotional barriers that kept her moving. "Most places want to know about husband or family, about references and permanent connections," she said finally. "A woman traveling alone raises questions that people would rather not ask or answer. It is easier to keep moving than to try explaining why I have no one to vouch for my character except the work itself." The honesty of her response struck Wamakaskin like a physical blow, forcing him to confront the parallels between their situations. He too had chosen isolation over the complications of trying to fit into communities that viewed him with suspicion or misunderstanding. But where his exile had been largely voluntary, hers seemed driven by necessity and the lack of alternatives. By late afternoon, they had made remarkable progress on the fence repairs, 3 sections had been completely rebuilt with new posts and rails, while several others had been reinforced and straightened to restore their structural integrity. The gate had received new hinges and a proper latch mechanism that would keep it securely closed against both weather and the determined efforts of horses seeking freedom. "We should finish tomorrow morning," Lucia estimated, stepping back to survey their work with critical professional assessment. "The remaining sections need attention, but nothing as extensive as what we have completed today." Wamakaskin nodded agreement, surprised by how quickly the day had passed in good company and productive labor. The fence already looked more substantial and permanent, its clean lines and tight joints a testament to the skill of its repairers. As evening approached, he faced a decision that had been building throughout the day. Lucia had mentioned no plans beyond completing the fence work, no destination waiting for her once this job was finished. The hospitable thing would be to offer her shelter for the night, but such an invitation carried implications that went beyond simple courtesy. "You are welcome to stay until the work is completed," he said finally, his tone carefully neutral. "The nights are growing cold, and there is no sense in you making camp in the open when I have space and warmth to share." Lucia studied his face, clearly weighing the offer against her own complex considerations of propriety and practical necessity. "I would be grateful for shelter," she said at length, "and I promise to earn my keep with good work and no trouble." As they gathered their tools and prepared to return to the cabin, Wamakaskin found himself looking forward to the evening ahead with an anticipation he had not felt in years. The day had reminded him of the satisfaction that came from shared accomplishment, from the easy camaraderie that developed between people working toward a common goal. But underneath his growing appreciation for Lucia's company lay deeper currents of emotion that he was not yet ready to examine. Her presence had awakened memories of Miguel and the friendship that had meant more to him than he had realized at the time. More troubling still, it had highlighted the emptiness of his self-chosen solitude and raised questions about whether isolation was truly the answer to the challenges he faced. The prairie wind picked up as they walked toward the cabin, carrying the scent of distant rain and the promise of weather changes to come. Overhead, the first stars began to appear in a sky that was deepening from blue to purple, and somewhere in the gathering darkness, a coyote called out to its pack with wild, lonely music that seemed to echo the yearning in Wamakaskin's own heart. Dawn broke gray and heavy over the Dakota Territory, with thick clouds rolling in from the northwest that promised the season's first serious storm before nightfall. Lucia woke to the sound of wind rattling the cabin's shutters and the distant rumble of thunder still hours away but growing steadily closer. She had slept on a bedroll near the fireplace, wrapped in one of Wamakaskin's spare blankets, and despite the hard floor beneath her, it had been the most restful night she had enjoyed in weeks. Wamakaskin was already awake, moving quietly around the kitchen to avoid disturbing her sleep. He had coffee brewing on the stove and was slicing salt pork for breakfast when Lucia stirred and sat up, immediately alert in the way of people who had learned that safety was always temporary and vigilance necessary for survival. "Storm coming," he said without turning around, having heard the subtle sounds of her awakening. "We should finish the fence work this morning before the weather turns serious. These early autumn storms can be violent, especially when they roll down from the northern plains." Lucia rose and folded her bedding with efficient movements, then moved to the window to study the approaching weather. The western horizon was dark with towering clouds that seemed to swallow the morning light, and the wind carried the distinctive smell of rain, mixed with something sharper and more ominous. "How much time do we have?" she asked, already calculating how quickly they could complete the remaining fence repairs. Her experience traveling across the territories had taught her to read weather signs almost as well as any plainsman, and what she saw in the sky suggested they were facing more than a simple rainstorm. Wamakaskin joined her at the window, his weathered face creased with concern as he studied the cloud formations. 4 hours, maybe 5 if we are fortunate, he estimated. But this has the look of a storm that will bring hail and high winds, the kind that can tear apart anything not properly secured. They ate breakfast quickly and gathered their tools, both understanding without discussion that speed would be essential if they hoped to complete their work before the weather made outdoor labor impossible. The remaining fence sections required less extensive repair than what they had tackled the previous day, but each joint and connection would need to be solid enough to withstand whatever nature was preparing to unleash. As they worked, Lucia found herself stealing glances at Wamakaskin, studying the practiced ease with which he handled both tools and materials. Yesterday's collaboration had revealed not just his skill as a craftsman, but also his character as a man who honored his commitments and treated others with respect regardless of their circumstances. The combination was rare enough in her experience to make her wonder what forces had driven him to choose solitude over community. "You mentioned trouble in Deadwood," she said as they fitted new rails into freshly cut mortises. "Was it just ignorance about working with Indians, or something more specific that ended your partnership with Miguel?" Wamakaskin's hands paused in their work, and for a moment Lucia thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of old pain that had never fully healed. "There was a man named Jeremiah Colt," he said slowly, his eyes focused on the wood in his hands rather than meeting her gaze. "He owned a freight company that carried supplies to the mining camps, and he had influence with the territorial officials who decided which contractors got the bigger construction jobs." Thunder rumbled closer now, and the wind picked up enough to send dried leaves skittering across the ground around their feet. Wamakaskin continued working as he talked, his movements automatic while his mind traveled back to events he had tried for years to forget. Colt decided that Indians working alongside white men was bad for business, that it made the mining companies uncomfortable to think their buildings were being raised by savage hands. He continued, bitter irony coloring his tone. "He started spreading stories about Miguel and me, claiming we were unreliable, that our work was inferior to what pure white crews could provide." Lucia felt anger building in her chest as she listened, recognizing the familiar pattern of prejudice disguised as business concern. She had faced similar attitudes from people who assumed that a Mexican woman could not possibly possess the skills necessary for quality craftsmanship. "Miguel tried to fight the rumors," Wamakaskin went on, his voice growing harder. "He took Colt to task publicly, challenged him to find any fault with structures we had built, offered to stand behind our work with money-back guarantees that no other contractors would match." The wind gusted stronger, and both of them had to steady their work against the weather's interference. Dark clouds now covered half the sky, and the air carried the electric tension that preceded serious storms. "What happened?" Lucia asked, though she suspected the answer would not be pleasant. Men like this Jeremiah Colt rarely responded well to public challenges, especially when those challenges came from people they considered beneath their notice. Wamakaskin set down his tools and looked directly at her for the first time since beginning his story. "Colt hired men to sabotage a barn we had just finished," he said flatly. "They loosened key joints and damaged support beams, then arranged for the building to collapse during a town meeting when it would be full of witnesses." Lucia's breath caught in her throat. "Were people hurt?" "3 men injured, 1 seriously," Wamakaskin replied, his voice heavy with guilt that still haunted him years later. "The collapse was blamed on faulty construction, of course." Colt made sure word spread that Indian craftsmanship was dangerous, that hiring mixed crews put innocent lives at risk. The first fat raindrops began to fall, spotting the dry ground around them with dark circles that promised deluge to come. They worked faster now, driven by both the approaching storm and the emotional weight of Wamakaskin's revelations. "Miguel knew the truth," Wamakaskin continued as they hammered the final rail into place. "He found evidence of the sabotage. Tool marks that did not match our work, foreign materials that had been used to weaken the structure. But when he tried to present his findings to the territorial authorities, they refused to listen. Lucia could picture her husband's frustration. Clearly, knowing how deeply Miguel believed in justice and fair dealing, he would have fought the false accusations with every tool at his disposal, unwilling to let lies stand unchallenged even when fighting seemed hopeless. That was when I decided to leave, Wamakaskin said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. I could see where the situation was heading, knew that continued resistance would only bring more trouble down on both of us. So I gathered my tools and disappeared one night, left Miguel a note explaining that some battles could not be won, and that my presence would only make things worse for him. The storm was upon them now, with heavy raindrops falling steadily and lightning beginning to flicker in the distance. They secured their tools quickly and ran for the shelter of the cabin, reaching the door just as the rainfall intensified from scattered drops to driving sheets that turned the prairie grass silver in the wind. Inside the cabin, they stood, dripping near the door while thunder crashed overhead and rain hammered against the windows with increasing fury. The storm had arrived with the sudden violence that characterized prairie weather, transforming the peaceful morning into something wild and potentially dangerous. I never heard from Miguel again after that night, Wamakaskin said as he hung his wet coat on a peg near the door. I often wondered if he tried to clear our names, if he ever found a way to expose Colt's sabotage and restore our reputations. Lucia wrung water from her hair and accepted a dry shirt that Wamakaskin offered, from his personal collection. He never spoke of it in his letters, she said thoughtfully. But Miguel was not one to burden others with his troubles, especially when writing to someone he wanted to protect from worry. Lightning flashed close enough to make the cabin's windows glow brilliant white, followed immediately by thunder so loud it seemed to shake the building's foundations. The storm was directly overhead now, unleashing the full fury of prairie weather on anything unfortunate enough to be caught in the open. As they waited for the storm to pass, Lucia found herself studying Wamakaskin's face in the flickering light from the fireplace he had hastily kindled. The story he had shared explained much about his choice to live in isolation, but it also raised new questions about the kind of man who would sacrifice his own livelihood to protect a friend from consequences they both faced. Why did you really leave? She asked gently, sensing that there were layers to his decision that went beyond simple pragmatism. A man like Miguel would never have wanted you to carry that burden alone. Wamakaskin stared into the fire for a long moment before answering, his weathered features reflecting the complex emotions that the day's revelations had stirred up. Because I was afraid, he said finally, the admission clearly painful despite its honesty. Not of Colt or his hired thugs, but of what my stubborn pride might cost someone I cared about. Rain continued to pound against the cabin's walls and roof, creating a steady drumming that made conversation feel more intimate and confessional. The storm had trapped them together in a small space filled with memories and unfinished emotional business. Miguel wrote about you in his final letter, Lucia said softly, reaching into her travel pack to retrieve a carefully folded piece of paper she had carried for 2 years. He was sick with the fever then, probably knew he was dying, but he used what strength he had left to write messages to people who had mattered to him. Wamakaskin's eyes widened as she unfolded the letter, revealing Miguel's distinctive handwriting, made unsteady by illness but still clearly legible. The sight of his old friend's words hit him like a physical blow, bringing back memories of easier times when the future had seemed full of promise rather than complications. He said he hoped you had found peace in whatever place you had chosen. Lucia read aloud, her voice gentle but clear above the storm's noise. He said he understood why you left, that he probably would have made the same choice if their positions had been reversed. But he also said he missed your friendship and hoped that someday your path would cross with someone who could appreciate your true worth. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning that neither was quite ready to examine directly. Outside, the storm raged with undiminished fury, but inside the cabin, a different kind of weather was building. charged with possibilities that scared them both. Lightning struck close enough to make the windows rattle, followed by thunder. That seemed to go on forever. In the sudden silence that followed, they could hear new sounds mixed with the rain. The distinctive noise of objects being blown around by wind, strong enough to move heavy materials. "Hail," Wamakaskin said grimly, recognizing the sharp clicking. Sounds that indicated ice was falling along with the rain. "The horses will need shelter." Thunder Walker knows to seek protection, but Wind Dancer sometimes panics in storms like this. He moved toward the door, despite the obvious danger of venturing outside during such violent weather. Lucia caught his arm, feeling the tension in his muscles as he prepared to face the storm's fury for the sake of his animals. "Let me help," she said firmly. "4 hands will be faster than 2, and we can watch out for each other." Wamakaskin looked at her for a moment, clearly torn between accepting assistance and protecting her from unnecessary risk. "The hail can be dangerous," he warned. "Stones large enough to knock a person unconscious, wind strong enough to blow you off your feet." "Miguel taught me that good partners share both the work and the risks," Lucia replied, already reaching for the oilcloth that would provide some protection against the storm's assault. "Besides, those horses helped us finish the fence by staying calm while we worked. We owe them shelter in return." Together they prepared to venture into the storm, wrapping themselves in oilcloth and gathering ropes that could serve as lifelines if the wind proved too strong to navigate safely. Through the windows they could see that the world outside had been transformed into something alien and hostile, with hailstones bouncing off the ground like scattered pearls and lightning turning the air electric blue. "Stay close to me," Wamakaskin instructed as he prepared to open the door. "If the wind separates us, follow the fence line back to the cabin. Do not try to search for me in this weather." Lucia nodded understanding, then surprised him by placing her hand briefly on his shoulder. "We will get through this together," she said with quiet confidence. "Just like we got through the fence." "Repairs." He looked at her one more time, seeing determination mixed with fear in her dark eyes, and felt something shift inside his chest. For the first time in years, he was not facing a crisis alone, was not forced to make decisions based solely on his own welfare and judgment. The door burst open the moment he unlatched it, driven by wind that seemed determined to tear the cabin apart, board by board. Hailstones the size of robin eggs pelted them immediately, stinging exposed skin and bouncing off their protective clothing, with sharp impacts that promised serious bruises. But they pressed forward together into the storm, united by shared purpose and the kind of trust that could only develop between people who had learned to depend on each other when everything else failed. The storm had passed by evening, leaving the prairie washed clean and gleaming under a sky that seemed impossibly wide after hours of being confined indoors. Lucia and Wamakaskin had successfully guided both horses to the safety of the small barn during the worst of the hail. Though not without cost, both bore purple bruises from ice stones that had found their mark despite their protective clothing. Now they sat on the cabin's front porch, sharing a simple supper while watching the last rays of sunlight paint the wet grassland in shades of gold and amber. Thunder Walker and Wind Dancer grazed peacefully in the corral, their newly repaired fence having weathered the storm without so much as a loose rail. The sight filled both Lucia and Wamakaskin with quiet satisfaction, proof that their hasty work had been solid enough to withstand nature's fury. Steam rose from the horses' backs as the evening warmth dried their rain-soaked coats, and occasionally one would lift its head to survey the transformed landscape with alert curiosity. "The fence held," Lucia observed with professional pride, gesturing toward the enclosure where their craftsmanship had proven itself under the most demanding conditions. Miguel always said the true test of any construction was not how it looked when finished, but how it performed when challenged by time and weather. Wamakaskin nodded agreement, though his attention seemed divided between the peaceful scene before them and some internal concern that had been growing throughout the day. Since their return from the storm, he had been quieter than usual, glancing frequently toward the eastern horizon as if expecting unwelcome visitors to appear at any moment. "You are worried about something," Lucia said, setting down her tin cup and studying his profile in the fading light. "Something beyond the weather and the fence repairs. What troubles you?" Wamakaskin was quiet for several moments, clearly debating whether to share his concerns with someone who had her own problems to worry about. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of hard-earned wisdom about the ways frontier life could turn dangerous without warning. "Storms like this drive people to seek shelter wherever they can find it," he said slowly, his eyes scanning the grassland that stretched endlessly in all directions. "Travelers, drifters, sometimes men who prefer to move under cover of bad weather because it hides their activities from honest folks." Lucia felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cooling air, understanding immediately that Wamakaskin was talking about the kind of men who made their living through violence and theft rather than honest work. Her months of traveling alone had taught her to recognize the signs of predators who targeted the isolated and vulnerable. "Has there been trouble in this area?" she asked, already calculating distances to the nearest settlements and wondering how quickly help could arrive if they found themselves in danger. The vast emptiness that had seemed peaceful moments before now took on a more ominous character. Wamakaskin's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, a subtle sign of tension that spoke to deeper concerns than simple caution. 3 weeks ago, a family of homesteaders was found dead 20 miles north of here, he said quietly. Burned out, their livestock stolen, no witnesses and no clear indication of who was responsible. The news hit Lucia like a physical blow, forcing her to confront the reality that the frontier's beauty came with dangers that could strike without warning or mercy. She had heard similar stories during her travels, whispered accounts of violence that served as cautionary tales for anyone foolish enough to believe that isolation guaranteed safety. The territorial marshal came through asking questions. Wamakaskin continued, his voice taking on the flat tone of someone reporting facts too grim for emotional embellishment. He said there were signs that more than one man was involved, that it was planned rather than random. The kind of crime that suggests organized outlaws rather than desperate drifters, as if summoned by their conversation about danger. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drifted across the evening air, growing steadily louder as multiple riders approached from the east. Both Lucia and Wamakaskin rose immediately, their shared meal forgotten as they focused on the distant figures that were emerging from the gathering twilight. "How many?" Lucia asked, automatically moving closer to Wamakaskin while her eyes strained to count the approaching riders. Her hand instinctively went to the heavy hammer hanging from Miguel's tool belt, a weapon of necessity rather than design but capable of defending her life if circumstances demanded it. "4 men, Wamakaskin replied after a moment of careful observation, his voice carrying the controlled calm of someone who had faced danger before and survived through preparation rather than panic. Riding hard, like they have somewhere important to be or something important to avoid, the riders resolved into clearer detail as they drew nearer, revealing 4 rough-looking men on horses that showed signs of hard use and poor care. Their leader was a tall, angular man with pale hair and eyes that seemed to take in everything while revealing nothing of his intentions. His companions had the weathered, dangerous look of men who lived outside the law and made their peace with violence as a daily reality. "Evening," the leader called out as they approached the cabin, his voice carrying a false friendliness that fooled no one. "Mighty fine place you have here. Mind if we water our horses and maybe dry out from that storm?" Wamakaskin stepped forward slightly, positioning himself between the strangers and Lucia, while maintaining the careful politeness that frontier etiquette demanded even in dangerous situations. "Water is freely given to any traveler," he replied evenly. "The well is beside the barn, help yourselves." The leader's pale eyes moved between Wamakaskin and Lucia with predatory assessment. taking note of their obvious partnership and the signs of recent work around the property. His gaze lingered on Lucia's tool belt with particular interest, as if calculating the value of quality equipment in a region where such things were scarce and expensive. "Appreciate the hospitality," the man said, dismounting with fluid grace. That spoke to years in the saddle. "Name's Pike, and these are my associates. We are heading south toward the railroad, looking for work and trying to stay ahead of the early winter weather." His associates remained mounted, their hands resting casually near the weapons they wore with practiced ease. Lucia noted that their eyes never stopped moving, constantly surveying the surroundings for threats, opportunities, or escape routes. These were not men seeking honest employment, whatever their leader might claim. Mighty unusual to see. "Woman doing man's work," Pike observed, nodding toward the repaired fence with exaggerated admiration. "Takes real skill to build something that clean and straight. Your husband teach you the trade?" The question carried implications that made Lucia's skin crawl, suggesting that Pike was probing for information about her circumstances and potential vulnerability. She forced herself to maintain steady eye contact while answering, knowing that any sign of fear would only encourage whatever plans he might be forming. "I learned from the best," she replied simply, offering no details about Miguel's death or her current status as a widow traveling alone. Beside her, she could feel Wamakaskin's tension increasing as he recognized the same dangerous undertones in Pike's seemingly casual questions. Pike smiled, an expression that never reached his cold eyes, and began walking slowly around the cabin's perimeter as if admiring the construction. His movement was clearly intended to survey the property's layout and defensive possibilities, the kind of reconnaissance that preceded either robbery or worse. "Fine craftsmanship everywhere I look," Pike continued, running his hand along the fence rails with mock appreciation. "Takes money to build like this, to buy quality materials and take time for proper joinery. Man would need steady income to afford such luxury." The implication was clear. Pike was fishing for information about Wamakaskin's resources and whether the property might be worth the risks associated with taking it by force. Lucia felt her heart rate increase as she realized they were being evaluated as potential victims rather than temporary hosts. "We make do with what the land provides," Wamakaskin replied carefully, his tone giving away nothing about his actual circumstances or the modest savings he had accumulated through years of careful living. Honest work and simple needs, nothing more. One of Pike's companions, a heavy-set man with cruel eyes and scarred hands, rode closer to the corral where Thunder Walker and Wind Dancer watched the proceedings with equine wariness. "Fine horses," he observed with obvious appreciation. "Paint stallion like that would bring good money in the right market." The threat was becoming more explicit now, moving beyond subtle probing toward direct intimidation. Lucia found herself calculating distances and angles, wondering if they could reach the cabin's interior before armed men on horseback could overtake them. The tool belt around her waist suddenly felt inadequate protection against the kind of violence these strangers represented. "Horses are not for sale," Wamakaskin said firmly, his voice carrying unmistakable finality despite the dangerous circumstances. "They are partners, not property to be traded," Pike laughed, a sound devoid of genuine humor that sent chills down Lucia's spine. "Everything is for sale, friend, if the price is right and the seller is properly motivated," he said with unveiled menace. "Sometimes motivation comes in forms that do not involve actual money." The cabin door was perhaps 20 feet away, but it might as well have been 20 miles given the speed with which mounted men could cover ground. Lucia began edging imperceptibly in that direction, hoping to reach the rifle she had seen hanging above Wamakaskin's fireplace without triggering immediate violence. "Now, I am wondering," Pike continued, his voice taking on a conversational tone that was somehow more frightening than open threats, "what a pretty little carpenter woman is doing out here in the middle of nowhere with just one Indian for protection. Seems like a situation that could benefit from additional security arrangements. Wamakaskin's hand moved slowly toward the knife at his belt, a weapon that would be useless against 4 armed men, but better than facing death empty-handed. "The lady is under my protection," he said with quiet dignity. "Any threat to her is a threat to me." "Protection," Pike mused, as if the word amused him greatly. Mighty big responsibility for one man, especially when that man might have other concerns to occupy his attention. Accidents happen out here on the frontier, particularly to folks who do not understand the importance of cooperation with their neighbors. The veiled reference to the murdered homesteaders was unmistakable, confirming Lucia's growing certainty that they were facing the same outlaws responsible for that earlier atrocity. Pike was essentially announcing his group's criminal activities, while threatening to add Wamakaskin and herself to their list of victims. "Water your horses and move on," Wamakaskin said with steel in his voice, abandoning all pretense of hospitality in favor of direct confrontation. "You are not welcome here, and your business is finished." Pike's expression hardened instantly, the mask of false friendliness dropping away to reveal the predator beneath. "Business is finished when I say it is finished," he snarled, his hand moving to the pistol at his hip. "And right now, I think our business is just getting started." The moment stretched taut as a bowstring, 4 armed men facing 2 people, whose only advantages were familiarity with the terrain and desperate determination to survive. Thunder Walker snorted and tossed his head, sensing the tension in the air and responding with the nervous energy of a creature bred for flight or fight. Lucia felt time slow as she prepared to run for the cabin, knowing that their only hope lay in reaching cover before Pike could draw his weapon and end the standoff with violence. But even as she calculated her chances, she wondered if Wamakaskin would follow or try to buy her escape time with his own life. 4 against 2 are not sporting odds, Pike observed with cruel satisfaction, clearly enjoying the fear he was creating. "But then, I have never been much interested in sport when business needs attending to." The sound of distant hoofbeats interrupted his threatening monologue, drawing everyone's attention toward the eastern horizon where new riders were approaching through the gathering darkness. Pike's expression shifted from confident menace to wary concern, as he tried to identify the newcomers and assess whether they represented help for his intended victims or complications for his plans. "More company," one of his associates observed, nervously, clearly uncomfortable with the possibility that their isolated crime scene might become crowded with potential witnesses. "Maybe we should finish this business and move on before things get complicated." Pike raised his hand for silence, his pale eyes straining to count the approaching figures and determine their intentions. The new arrivals were still too distant to identify clearly, but their numbers appeared to match his own group, eliminating the advantage he had counted on to overwhelm Wamakaskin and Lucia. "Could be law," another of his men muttered, nervousness evident in his voice. "Marshall said he might be back through this area, checking on folks after that storm." The possibility of facing territorial law enforcement clearly did not appeal to Pike, whose confidence began to waver as he weighed the risks of proceeding with his original plan against the wisdom of retreating to fight another day. His eyes darted between his intended victims and the approaching riders, calculating odds that were shifting rapidly against him. Lucia felt a surge of desperate hope as she realized that rescue might be approaching, though she knew better than to count on salvation until it actually arrived. Too many things could still go wrong. Too many ways for violence to erupt before help could intervene effectively. "Time to go," Pike announced abruptly, his decision clearly influenced by the deteriorating tactical situation. "But this conversation is not finished, friends. We will be back when circumstances are more favorable for completing our business." The threat hung in the air like smoke as Pike and his men mounted their horses and rode away into the gathering night, their departure as sudden as their arrival had been. But Lucia knew that the danger had not passed, only been postponed until these predators could return with better odds and fewer complications. As the hoofbeats of Pike's group faded into the distance, the approaching riders resolved into clearer detail, revealing 4 men in the uniforms of territorial marshals led by a grizzled veteran whose badge caught the last rays of sunlight. Relief flooded through Lucia like cool water, though she remained tense until the lawmen had dismounted and identified themselves properly. Marshal Tom Bradley, the leader announced, his weathered face creased with concern as he surveyed the scene. "We have been tracking a group of outlaws through this territory, dangerous men wanted for multiple murders and robberies. You folks seen anyone suspicious in the area?" Marshal Tom Bradley stood in the lamplight of Wamakasken's cabin, his weathered hands holding a collection of wanted posters that seemed to represent every nightmare the frontier could produce. The 4 lawmen had accepted Wamakasken's invitation to spend the night after hearing about Pike's threatening visit, and now they spread their grim documentation across the kitchen table like cards in a deadly game of chance. The yellowed papers told stories of violence that stretched across 3 territories, each sketch capturing the face of someone who had chosen murder and theft as their profession. "This is him," Lucia said without hesitation, pointing to a sketch that captured Pike's angular features and cold eyes with disturbing accuracy. The artist had managed to convey not just the physical details, but something of the essential cruelty that had emanated from the man like heat from a forge. The man who called himself Pike, though I suspect that name is as false as his claim to be seeking honest work. Bradley nodded grimly, his expression growing darker as he studied the poster that bore the heading, "Wanted Dead or Alive," in bold letters that had faded with age and handling. Silas Crane, real name, though he has used a dozen others over the past 5 years, he said, his voice carrying the weight of too many crimes and too few successes. Wanted for murder, robbery, arson, and crimes against women that decent folks should not have to hear described in detail. Wamakasken leaned forward to examine the other sketches, recognizing the scarred features of Crane's companions from their brief but threatening encounter. The drawings captured not just their physical appearances, but something of their essential brutality, the kind of men who had chosen violence as their primary tool for solving life's problems. Each face told a story of choices made and lines crossed until nothing remained of whatever humanity they might once have possessed. Deputy Marshal Jake Santos, a young man whose face showed the premature hardness that came from witnessing too much evil too early in life, spread additional papers across the table. These contained detailed reports of crimes committed across the Dakota and Wyoming territories, written in the careful handwriting of lawmen who understood that documentation might be the only justice victims ever received. "How many people have they killed?" Lucia asked, though part of her did not want to know the answer. The coldness in Crane's eyes had suggested depths of cruelty that she preferred not to contemplate, but understanding their enemy seemed essential for survival. Knowledge was a weapon that might prove useful in the battles to come. 14 confirmed victims over the past 2 years, Santos replied, his young face hard with anger that spoke to personal investment in bringing these killers to justice. Probably more that we have not discovered yet. Isolated homesteads where entire families disappeared without witnesses or survivors to tell their stories. The frontier is vast enough to hide 1,000 crimes. The number hit Lucia like a physical blow, forcing her to confront the reality that she and Wamakasken had come within moments of becoming statistics in that grim tally. Only the fortuitous arrival of the marshals had prevented their cabin from becoming another crime scene, their lives from being snuffed out by men who killed as casually as other people, ate breakfast, or mended fence rails. Deputy Marshal Robert Hemley, an older man whose gray beard and steady eyes spoke of decades spent pursuing frontier criminals, unfolded a hand-drawn map that showed the pattern of Crane's movements across the territories. Red marks indicated known crime sites, While blue lines trace the routes, law enforcement believe the outlaws used to move between targets and escape zones. They have been moving steadily south, Marshal Bradley continued, pointing to the progression of crimes that formed a rough diagonal across the map, hitting isolated targets, taking whatever valuables they can find, leaving no witnesses to identify them or testify against them in court. Each attack is planned with military precision. The red marks on the map created a pattern that pointed directly toward the area where Wamakaskin's cabin sat like a vulnerable target. The progression suggested methodical planning rather than random violence, predators who selected their victims carefully based on factors like isolation, apparent wealth, and likelihood of successful escape afterward. Why here specifically? Wamakaskin asked, studying the map with the tactical awareness of someone who had learned to read terrain and movement patterns during his years as a hunter, tracking game across endless prairie. What makes this particular area attractive to men like Crane and his associates? Santos pointed to a series of marks that indicated river crossings, game trails, and supply routes connecting the northern territories to the railroad towns developing in the south. Perfect location for men who need to move stolen goods quickly and disappear before law enforcement can organize pursuit, he explained with the expertise of someone who had studied criminal behavior extensively. Remote enough to avoid casual observation, but connected enough to reach markets where stolen horses and equipment can be sold without uncomfortable questions. The strategic analysis was sobering, revealing that Crane's visit had not been random, but part of a larger operational plan that treated Wamakaskin's property as a resource to be exploited. The well-maintained horses, quality tools, and evidence of modest prosperity had marked them as worthwhile targets in the outlaws' deadly calculations, identifying them as victims worth the risks of returning to finish interrupted business. Marshal Bradley pulled out a leather journal filled with notes written in his careful handwriting, documentation of patterns and behaviors observed during months of pursuit. Crane operates like a military commander rather than a common criminal, he said, flipping through pages of accumulated intelligence. He scouts targets carefully, plans escape routes in advance, and maintains discipline among his men that prevents the kind of mistakes that usually lead to capture. The fourth member of their group, Deputy Marshal William Cross, had remained silent throughout most of the discussion, but now he spoke with the authority of someone who had personal experience with Crane's methods. I was part of the pursuit. After the Hendricks family massacre, he said quietly, his voice carrying echoes of old trauma. Arrived 6 hours after the attack and found evidence of planning that went back weeks. Lucia found herself leaning forward despite her revulsion, understanding that every detail about their enemies might prove crucial for survival. What kind of planning? She asked, forcing herself to focus on practical intelligence rather than the emotional horror of families destroyed by violence. Cross consulted his own notes before answering, clearly drawing on memories he would prefer to forget. Observation. Posts established on hills overlooking the homestead. Evidence of multiple reconnaissance visits. Knowledge of the family's daily routines that could only have come from extended surveillance, he explained methodically. They knew when the father worked his fields, when the mother visited neighbors, when the children played outside. The level of preparation described by Cross added new dimensions to the threat they faced, transforming Crane from a simple criminal into something approaching a military opponent. The realization that they might already be under observation, that their own routines and vulnerabilities were being cataloged for future exploitation, sent chills down Lucia's spine. They will be back, Bradley said with grim certainty, his experience with frontier criminals providing unwelcome insights into their likely behavior. Crane does not like being denied what he wants, and he considers witnesses to his activities as problems that need to be eliminated permanently. Your survival of his initial visit makes you targets he cannot afford to leave alive. Wamakaskin walked to the window and peered out at the moonlit prairie, his hunter's instincts alert for any sign of movement or disturbance that might indicate hostile observation. "How long do we have?" he asked without turning around, his voice carrying the practical tone of someone accustomed to making life or death decisions based on limited information. Crane typically waits 3 to 5 days before returning to targets that showed promise. "But we're interrupted," Bradley replied, consulting his journal for specific patterns observed in previous cases. "Gives potential victims time to relax their guard while allowing him to gather additional intelligence about changed circumstances, new arrivals, or law enforcement presence." The timeline was brutally short, providing barely enough time to prepare adequate defenses while leaving little room for second thoughts or alternative planning. Lucia felt the weight of decision pressing down on her like physical force, demanding choices that would determine whether she lived to see another week or joined the growing list of Crane's victims. Santos spread tactical sketches across the table, showing various defensive positions and fields of fire around Wamakaskin's property. "We have been developing contingency plans for exactly this type of situation," he said with professional enthusiasm that seemed inappropriate given the deadly circumstances. "Your location offers several advantages for setting a trap that could finally end Crane's reign of terror." The sketches revealed that the marshals had been studying Wamakaskin's property with military thoroughness, identifying sight lines, cover positions, and approach routes that could be used either offensively or defensively. Every building, every fence line, every natural depression in the ground had been evaluated for its tactical potential. "What would such a plan require?" Wamakaskin asked, turning from the window to study the tactical diagrams with growing interest. "What risks would we be accepting? And what support could you provide if we agreed to participate in this operation?" Henley took charge of the tactical briefing, his gray head bent over the sketches as he explained the proposed operation with professional competence. "We position concealed marksmen in predetermined locations around your property," he began, pointing to various defensive positions. "When Crane returns with his men, we spring a coordinated ambush that prevents escape while minimizing danger to civilian participants." Lucia studied the tactical plan with growing unease, recognizing that even the best military strategies carried significant risks of failure that could prove fatal for those caught in the crossfire. "What happens if something goes wrong?" she asked pointedly, her experience as Miguel's wife having taught her to question optimistic assumptions about dangerous undertakings. "What happens if Crane suspects a trap or approaches with more men than you anticipate?" The question prompted uncomfortable silence from the lawmen, whose professional optimism could not completely mask the genuine dangers inherent in their proposal. Cross was the first to respond, his honesty born from personal experience with operations that had gone terribly wrong. "Then you die," he said simply, his blunt words cutting through any illusions about the stakes involved. "Crane will not leave witnesses alive, and if our trap fails, you will pay the price for our failure with your lives. That is the reality of the situation, and you deserve to know it before making any decisions about participation." The stark assessment forced Lucia to confront the choice between certain continued danger and the possibility of ending that danger through accepting even greater immediate risk. Neither option offered guaranteed safety, but one provided at least the theoretical chance of returning to something resembling normal life. Bradley pulled out additional documentation, reports from previous operations against Crane that provided sobering context for their current proposal. "I need to be completely honest about our track record," he said with obvious reluctance. 3 previous attempts to capture Crane and his gang, with mixed results that cost good people their lives. The admission hit the room like cold water, forcing everyone present to confront the reality that law enforcement's previous efforts against Crane had been largely unsuccessful. Lucia felt her stomach tighten as she realized they were being asked to risk everything on tactics that had already failed multiple times. "Tell us about those failures," Wamakaskin said quietly, his dark eyes fixed on Bradley's weathered face. What went wrong, and what did you learn that might prevent similar mistakes this time? Bradley consulted his journal reluctantly, clearly revisiting memories he would prefer to forget. First attempt was near Cheyenne, spring of last year. He began with clinical detachment. Received word that Crane was planning to hit a wealthy rancher's spread. Set up an ambush based on intelligence that proved to be deliberately false. Crane never showed, but our presence alerted him that law enforcement was actively hunting him. The pattern of failure continued as Bradley described the second operation, an attempted trap at a river crossing that Crane had used repeatedly. In the past, he approached cautiously, spotted our positions from a distance, and simply turned around and left, Bradley admitted. We waited 3 days in hiding positions before accepting that he was not coming back to that particular location. The third operation had been the disaster that Cross had referenced earlier, an attempt to intercept Crane after a robbery that had gone catastrophically wrong when the outlaws arrived with twice the expected numbers and heavy weapons that outmatched the marshal's equipment. 2 lawmen had died, and Crane had escaped with minimal losses to his own forces. However, Santos interjected with youthful optimism. Each failure taught us valuable lessons about Crane's methods and capabilities. This operation would incorporate everything we have learned while taking advantage of circumstances that are uniquely favorable for our success. Lucia remained skeptical despite Santos's enthusiasm, her practical mind focused on the deadly consequences of optimistic planning that failed to account for enemy capabilities and determination. What makes this situation different from your previous attempts? She asked with pointed directness. What advantages do we have now that you lacked during those earlier operations? The question prompted animated discussion among the marshals, as they outlined the factors that distinguish their current opportunity from past failures. The defensive advantages of Wamakaskin's property, the intelligence gathered from their previous encounters with Crane, and the element of surprise that came from using civilians as apparently vulnerable bait, all contributed to what they considered improved odds of success. But as Lucia listened to their arguments, she could not escape the feeling that they were asking her and Wamakaskin to gamble their lives on assumptions that might prove as fatally flawed as those that had led to previous disasters. The stakes were too high and the odds too uncertain for comfort, yet the alternative of passive waiting for Crane's return offered no better prospects for survival. We need time to discuss this privately, she said finally, her voice steadier than she felt despite the magnitude of the decision they faced. This choice will affect both of us permanently, and we should make it together rather than under pressure from external circumstances or well-meaning law enforcement officials. Marshal Bradley nodded understanding, recognizing that asking civilians to risk their lives in a law enforcement operation deserved more consideration than could be provided during a single evening's discussion. Take whatever time you need, he said graciously. But remember that every day we delay gives Crane additional opportunities to kill other innocent people who lack even the protection we can offer you. The weight of that responsibility settled over the cabin like smoke from a dying fire, adding moral pressure to the already overwhelming practical considerations they faced. The marshals retired to the barn for the night, leaving Lucia and Wamakaskin alone, with a decision that would determine not just their survival, but their ability to live with themselves regardless of the outcome they chose. The pre-dawn darkness held a stillness that seemed unnatural, as if the prairie itself was holding its breath in anticipation of the violence to come. Lucia crouched behind the stone foundation of Wamakaskin's well, Miguel's heavy hammer gripped in her calloused hands, while her eyes scanned the eastern horizon for any sign of movement. 3 days had passed since their decision to participate in Marshal Bradley's trap, 3 days of careful preparation that had transformed the peaceful homestead into a carefully orchestrated killing ground. Wamakaskin lay concealed in the hayloft of his barn, a borrowed rifle steady in his hands as he watched the northern approach where game trails converged near a stand of cottonwood trees. His position offered commanding views of the cabin and corral, while providing multiple escape routes if the battle turned against them. Every detail of the defensive plan had been rehearsed until their movements became instinctive, muscle memory. That might mean the difference between life and death when violence erupted. Marshal Bradley occupied a spider hole dug beneath the cabin's front porch, his weathered face painted with mud and charcoal to eliminate reflective skin that might give away his position. Deputy Santos crouched behind the corral fence where loose boards had been arranged to provide firing ports while maintaining the appearance of normal disrepair. The other two marshals had positioned themselves along the creek bed that meandered past the property's southern boundary, ready to prevent escape in that direction. The bait that would draw Crane into their carefully prepared ambush consisted of obvious signs of wealth and vulnerability deliberately left visible around the property. Thunder Walker and Wind Dancer grazed peacefully in the corral, their magnificent forms calculated to attract the attention of men who valued horseflesh above human life. Tools and equipment lay scattered near the barn in arrangements that suggested careless prosperity, while smoke rising from the cabin's chimney indicated normal domestic activity. But beneath this facade of normalcy lay a web of deadly preparations that had required 3 full days to implement properly. Trip wires connected to alarm bells were hidden along likely approach routes, while carefully positioned mirrors would reflect sunlight to signal the arrival of hostile forces. Spare weapons and ammunition had been cached at strategic locations, and escape routes had been cleared and marked for use during darkness or emergency withdrawal. Lucia shifted slightly in her hiding place, feeling the weight of responsibility that came with choosing to fight rather than flee. The decision had not been easy, requiring long conversations with Wamakaskin about values worth dying for and futures worth protecting. Miguel's memory had influenced her choice, his voice echoing in her mind with reminders that some battles chose the fighters rather than the other way around. The eastern horizon began to show the first faint traces of dawn, pale light that would soon eliminate the advantage of darkness while making their concealed positions more vulnerable to detection. According to Bradley's intelligence, Crane typically struck during the uncertain light of early morning, when visibility was poor enough to mask his approach but sufficient to identify targets and navigate unfamiliar terrain. A meadowlark called from somewhere in the distance, its liquid song seeming incongruous against the tension that filled the air like electricity before a thunderstorm. Lucia found herself thinking about Miguel, wondering what he would have made of her current circumstances and whether he would have approved of her decision to stand and fight rather than seeking safety through flight. The first sign of trouble came from Thunder Walker, whose head lifted suddenly as his nostrils flared to catch scents carried on the morning breeze. The paint stallion's ears swiveled toward the eastern approach, his body language shifting from relaxed grazing to alert attention that indicated the presence of strangers in his territory. Wamakaskin had warned that his horses were better than any human sentry at detecting approaching riders. Lucia felt her heart rate increase as she spotted the flash of reflected sunlight from Bradley's signal mirror, the agreed-upon indication that hostile forces had been sighted approaching from the expected direction. 4 riders moving in single file along the game trail, their pace deliberate and their formation suggesting military-style discipline rather than casual travel. Through the gap between stone foundation blocks, she could see Silas Crane's angular figure leading his men toward what they believed would be easy prey. The outlaw leader rode with the confidence of someone who had never failed to take what he wanted through violence and intimidation, unaware that his intended victims had transformed themselves into hunters laying in wait for unwary predators. Crane's 3 companions spread out as they approached the cabin, their movements coordinated in a manner that spoke to extensive experience working together during violent encounters. Each man carried multiple weapons and moved with the fluid grace of practiced killers, who had survived dozens of similar attacks through skill, ruthlessness, and careful attention to tactical details. The plan called for the outlaws to be allowed to approach within 50 yards of the cabin before the trap was sprung, close enough to prevent escape, but far enough to provide room for maneuvering if the initial volley failed to end the fight quickly. Lucia forced herself to remain motionless as Crane's horse stepped delicately over one of their hidden tripwires, the mechanism designed to activate only when multiple riders had passed beyond the point of easy retreat. Crane dismounted near the corral fence, his pale eyes scanning the property with predatory assessment, while his companions took positions that would provide covering fire during the anticipated assault on the cabin. The outlaw leader's movements were deliberate and confident, those of a man who had repeated this deadly ritual so many times that it had become routine rather than challenging. "Hello, the house," Crane called out in a voice that carried false friendliness over undertones of menace. "We have come back to finish our conversation about cooperative arrangements and mutual benefits. I trust you have had time to consider the wisdom of accepting our generous offer of protection services." The mocking tone made Lucia's blood boil with anger that threatened to overwhelm the careful discipline necessary for their ambush to succeed. She forced herself to remain hidden while Crane continued his theatrical performance, playing the role of reasonable businessman rather than acknowledging his true nature as a cold-blooded killer. Wamakaskin's voice emerged from the cabin's interior, carefully modulated to suggest fear and submission rather than the deadly resolve that actually filled his heart. "We have been discussing your proposition," he called back, his words carrying just enough tremor to convince Crane that intimidation had achieved its intended effect. "Perhaps we can reach some accommodation that serves everyone's interests." Crane smiled with predatory satisfaction, clearly believing that his reputation for violence had cowed his intended victims into submission. "Wise decision," he replied, gesturing for his men to move closer to the cabin while maintaining their tactical positions. "I knew you would see reason once you had time to consider the alternatives to cooperation." The outlaw leader began walking toward the cabin door with casual arrogance, apparently convinced that resistance had been abandoned in favor of capitulation. His hand rested on his pistol grip with practiced ease, ready to draw and fire at the first sign of treachery, but his overall demeanor suggested confidence that violence would not be necessary. Lucia watched through her concealment as Crane passed within 15 feet of her hiding place, close enough that she could see the cruel satisfaction in his pale eyes and smell the unwashed stench of his clothes and body. The man radiated evil with an almost physical presence, the accumulated weight of 14 murders and countless other crimes creating an aura of menace that seemed to pollute the morning air. "Step outside where we can talk properly," Crane commanded, his voice hardening as he approached the cabin door. "Bring your woman with you so we can discuss the terms of our arrangement face to face. I prefer to conduct business with all interested parties, present and accounted for." The moment stretched taut as a bowstring while everyone waited for the signal that would transform careful preparation into explosive violence. Lucia's grip tightened on her hammer as she prepared to emerge from concealment, knowing that the next few minutes would determine whether justice or evil triumphed in this remote corner of the Dakota Territory. Bradley's rifle shot shattered the morning stillness like breaking glass, the carefully aimed bullet taking one of Crane's men out of his saddle before the sound of the report had fully registered in conscious minds. The trap was sprung with deadly efficiency as concealed lawmen opened fire from multiple positions, crossfire designed to prevent escape while eliminating the outlaws' ability to coordinate their response. Crane spun toward the source of gunfire. With reflexes honed by years of violent encounters, his pistol clearing leather with snake-like speed as he sought targets among enemies who had seemed to materialize from empty ground. His remaining 2 men returned fire wildly, their shots scattered and ineffective as they struggled to identify threats that attacked from unexpected directions. Lucia burst from her hiding place as planned, charging toward Crane with Miguel's hammer raised high and a war cry that would have made her Apache ancestors proud. The outlaw leader turned toward this new threat with startled surprise, clearly unprepared for hand-to-hand combat. With a woman wielding a carpenter's tool as a weapon of war, Crane's pistol swung toward Lucia with deadly intent, but Wamakaskan's rifle spoke from the barn loft before the outlaw could complete his aim. The bullet struck Crane's gun hand with precise accuracy, sending his weapon spinning away into the prairie grass, while he howled with pain and rage at the sudden reversal of his fortunes. The battle dissolved into chaos as wounded outlaws tried to reach their horses while lawmen pressed their advantage with disciplined fire that prevented organized retreat. Santos emerged from behind the corral fence to engage Crane's men at close range, his rifle working with mechanical precision to eliminate threats that had terrorized the territory for too long. One of Crane's remaining associates managed to reach his horse and attempted to flee toward the creek, only to ride directly into the guns of the marshals positioned along that escape route. The sound of gunfire echoed across the prairie like thunder as Cross and Henley ended the outlaws' flight with overlapping shots that dropped both horse and rider in a tangle of thrashing limbs. Crane himself proved more resilient than his men, drawing a backup pistol from his boot, despite his wounded hand, and continuing to fight with the desperate fury of a cornered wolf. His shots came close enough to force Lucia to dive for cover behind the well, stone chips flying as bullets struck the masonry with ringing impacts. Wamakaskan descended from the barn loft with fluid grace, his rifle reloaded and ready as he moved to support Lucia's assault on the outlaw leader. The two of them worked in perfect coordination, their partnership forged through shared danger, creating tactical understanding that needed no verbal communication. "Give up, Crane," Bradley shouted from his position beneath the porch, his voice carrying official authority backed by overwhelming firepower. "Your men are down and you are surrounded. Surrender now and you will live to face trial, rather than dying in the dirt like the animal you have become." Crane's response was a snarl of defiance accompanied by wild shots that spoke to desperation rather than tactical thinking. The outlaw leader had built his reputation on inspiring fear in helpless victims, but now found himself facing opponents who refused to be intimidated by his reputation for violence and cruelty. Lucia seized the moment when Crane paused to reload, launching herself from cover with the hammer swinging in a deadly arc toward his skull. The outlaw tried to dodge while fumbling with cartridges, but his wounded hand betrayed him at the crucial moment, and he stumbled backward over his own feet. The hammer caught Crane in the shoulder with bone-crushing force, spinning him around and sending him crashing to the ground in a heap of tangled limbs. Miguel's tool, blessed by years of honest work, had finally found a target worthy of its accumulated power and righteousness. Wamakaskan reached the fallen outlaw first, his rifle barrel pressed against Crane's throat while cold eyes promised death if the wounded man so much as to twitch toward another weapon. The hunter's face was painted with fury that reflected years of frustration at injustices that had gone unpunished for too long. "Move and I will kill you where you lie," Wamakaskan promised with quiet sincerity, his finger resting lightly on the trigger while Crane glared up at him with hatred that seemed to burn like physical fire. "Your reign of terror ends here, in the dirt where it belongs." The surviving marshals emerged from their positions to secure the scene, their faces grim with satisfaction at finally bringing Silas Crane's criminal career to its violent conclusion. Santos moved among the fallen outlaws to confirm that all threats had been eliminated, while Bradley approached the captured leader with handcuffs that seemed inadequate restraints for someone who had caused so much death and suffering. Lucia stood over Crane's prostrate form with Miguel's hammer still gripped in her hands, feeling a mixture of triumph and revulsion at the violence that had been necessary to stop his depredations. The outlaw's pale eyes held no remorse for his crimes, only rage at being thwarted by people he had considered beneath his notice. 14 innocent people," she said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of all Crane's victims as she looked down at their killer. 14 families destroyed by your greed and cruelty. Was it worth it? Was the money and fear worth becoming the monster that children have nightmares about? Crane's only response was a string of curses that revealed the poverty of his soul, words that carried no power to harm anyone now that his capacity for violence had been broken. Bradley hauled the wounded outlaw to his feet with professional efficiency, the handcuffs clicking shut around wrists that would never again hold weapons for the purpose of murder. The aftermath of battle brought strange quiet to the homestead as adrenaline faded and the reality of survival began to sink into minds that had been focused entirely on the deadly business of fighting for their lives. Smoke drifted from scattered positions where gunpowder had burned, and the acrid smell mixed with morning air that suddenly seemed sweeter than any perfume. Santos and Cross worked together to gather the outlaws' weapons and search their belongings for evidence that might help solve other crimes committed during their reign of terror. The dead men's pockets yielded jewelry and personal items that had obviously been taken from victims, grim trophies that would need to be returned to grieving families if their origins could be determined. "It is finished," Bradley announced, with satisfaction that carried undertones of relief at finally bringing Crane to justice. "The territory will sleep safer tonight, knowing that this particular evil has been eliminated from the world. You have both earned the gratitude of every honest person from here to the Canadian border." Wamakaskan helped Lucia to her feet, both of them moving with the careful motions of people who had survived violence but carried its physical and emotional toll in their bodies. The morning sun climbed higher over the Dakota Territory, illuminating a homestead that had been transformed from peaceful sanctuary to battlefield and back, again in the space of a few violent minutes. "What happens now?" Lucia asked, looking at the blood-stained ground where evil men had fallen and wondering how long it would take forth prairie grass to erase all traces of their final crimes. "What happens to us, and what happens to him?" Bradley glanced toward Crane, who sat propped against the corral fence while Cross bandaged his wounds with professional competence. "He will face trial in Bismarck for the crimes we can prove, though I suspect the rope will claim him long before he serves any significant prison time," the marshal replied with grim satisfaction. "As for you two, there will be questions to answer and testimony to give, but you are heroes rather than criminals." The word heroes seemed inadequate to describe people who had simply refused to become victims, but Lucia understood that their actions would become part of frontier legend, stories told around campfires and in saloons where courage was valued above all other virtues. They had stood their ground against evil and emerged victorious, earning their place in the chronicles of those who chose to fight rather than surrender. As the marshals prepared to transport their prisoner to face justice, Lucia and Wamakaskan stood together beside the fence they had repaired just days earlier, watching the sun climb toward its zenith over a landscape that suddenly seemed peaceful again. The ordeal was over, but its resolution had changed them both in ways that would take time to fully understand. Miguel would have been proud, Wamakaskan said quietly, his hand resting gently on Lucia's shoulder as they watched the lawmen ride away with their captive. "You fought with his courage and his determination to see justice done regardless of personal cost." Lucia leaned against the fence rail that bore the marks of their shared craftsmanship, feeling the solid strength of wood joined with skill and care. "We fought together," she corrected with a smile that carried new warmth despite the morning's violence. "Partners, just as Miguel and you once were, standing against those who would destroy what good people try to build." The prairie wind carried away the last echoes of gunfire and conflict, leaving only the eternal whisper of grass and the distant call of birds greeting another day in the Dakota Territory. Justice had been served and evil defeated, but more importantly, two people had found in each other the kind of partnership that could weather any storm the frontier might bring.
Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.